Question number 6, the Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister of Health. When was he informed that the Ministry of Health request for capital injection to fund the fit-out of its new headquarters was not supported by Treasury and, quote, exposed a serious failure of financial management within the ministry, end quote?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, I was informed by the Director-General of Health in mid-February 2015. The Director-General advised me that he was calling in PricewaterhouseCoopers to both give advice on resolving the funding issue and to provide independent advice on improving the Ministry's financial management. I told Mr Chua very clearly that what had happened was unacceptable, that it would not happen again, and that the matter had to be resolved, and subsequently it has been.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
In light of the exposure of serious financial management problems within the Ministry of Health under the current Director-General when he was acting in the role in 2013, did he raise any concerns with the State Service Commission before agreeing to the permanent appointment of the Director-General in 2015? If not, why not?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, I think it's very unfair to go after a defenceless public servant, but what I will say is the State Services Commissioner was very happy to appoint Mr Chua because he was the best man for the job.
Can the member please resume, the Minister resume his seat?
Point of order, Mr Speaker. You accepted the question.
But I now want to hear the answer.
Yeah, well, he wasn't answering it.
Can we now give the Minister an opportunity to answer the question? Well, then I didn't hear the answer, so I invite the member to ask the question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In light of the exposure of serious financial mismanagement in the Ministry of Health under the current Director-General when he was acting in the role from 2013, did he raise any concerns with the State Service Commission before agreeing to the permanent appointment of the Director-General in 2015? If not, why not?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
I think it's pretty bad form for the member to attack a public servant when he can't defend himself personally, but Mr Chua was appointed because he was the very best person for the job.
Order. Order. I'll allow the member an additional supplementary question because I don't think it's been answered.
No, thank you, Mr Speaker.
Right, the Honourable Annette King, supplementary question.
Why did he not make the PricewaterhouseCoopers report into the serious financial management public after it was presented in June last year, rather than wait for it to be discovered through an Official Information Act request? Could the Minister please answer that question?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Well, I know the member's trying to make out there's some sort of cover-up, but that's complete nonsense.
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable... Order. Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Why did he only receive verbal briefings on the issue of serious financial mismanagement from the Director-General of Health after he was informed there was a problem?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
I'm quite satisfied with the way that this whole issue has been resolved.
Point of order first,
Point
Mr.
of
Speaker.
order, the Honourable Annette King.
I seek leave to table a letter from the Ministry of Health to our research unit saying the Minister only received verbal briefings from the Director-General on this matter.
Order. Leave sought to table that particular document. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be tabled.
Supplementary question, Mr.
Supplementary
Speaker.
question, the Honourable Annette King. Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable
Clown over there.
There's the arrogance.
What?
Order. If the Honourable Paula Bennett would prefer to leave question time, she's welcome. Otherwise, please cooperate. The Honourable
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What was the cost? What was the cost of the PricewaterhouseCoopers report, an inquiry which the Secretary of Treasury requested, and not the Director-General of Health, even though he claimed he had asked for it on Radio New Zealand this morning?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
I'm quite happy to go and find the answer to that question for you, but I haven't got it on me now.
This is my last one. You gave me an extra, didn't you, Mr.
I
Speaker?
gave
Yes,
one.
thank you.
Supplementary question.
Thank you.
The Honourable Annette King.
Thank you. Where will the Ministry of Health, to quote him, be finding that $18 million needed to pay for the refurbishment? Will it be coming from funding better use for health services?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Well, that's an excellent question. It's coming from the departmental expenditure. So under the Labor government, that was $230 million. We've reduced that to $190 million. There were 1,500 people in the ministry when Annette King was running it. There's now 1,100, but we're producing better results for New Zealanders. So very good question. Thank you.
Order. 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 Question